Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the DESIS Philosophy Talk 7.3, which is the opening event of Politecnico di Milano PhD Summer School. The conversation today will be about the politics of nature, designing scenarios of multi-species collaborative survival. And I would like to have Paola Bertola to introduce us a collaboration that is already an ongoing one.
Yes, thanks, Chiara. I'm really glad to open this edition of DESIS Philosophy Talks. It's a little bit more than a year, and the pandemic was only a fear, but not a reality, and we started to our PhD festival last year with this collaboration with DESIS Talk. I have to thank, first of all, Virginia Tassinari, which have been the inspiration for this link. And I also think that this is the perfect match among our class, the PhD Summer School, and DESIS Philosophy Talk. As you will see just in a moment, DESIS Philosophy Talk has this format that brings to design distinguished perspectives from distinguished guests, designers, professionals, but majorly also scholars from other disciplines, trying to contribute to one of the goals that I did declare in the beginning of this class. So being much more committed to build our own ontology within the design context, being able to build our path in terms of epistemological vision of design disciplines, which will certainly reinforce our capacity to run design research or better research through design, and to better clarify which can be our contribution and our impacts in terms of also contemporary and future challenges that we're all facing. So I think that DESIS Philosophy Talks is really the perfect format to open our PhD design school, which is also a course that is conceived to contribute to this same dimension. So you see here that the cooperation with DESIS network has already some little contribution and experiences done. Starting last end January, and we do hope that we will grow this cooperation in the future together with Virginia, as this series of events that actually was inspired and started at Polimi by the initiative of Virginia Tassinari and also Ezio Manzini is truly important to the growth of our disciplines. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to the very important guests that will contribute to the discussion this afternoon, and I only wish you the best for the continuation.
Thanking Paola, really, because this is a very special opportunity that we have at this space that we are creating together to have this conversations that are much needed. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Very briefly, it's you know, like it's a packed program we have, so I'll try to go as fast as I can. DESIS Philosophy Talk indeed started 9 years ago, and it started with a series of conversation, very informal conversation happening with amongst myself, but also with Ezio Manzini and Victor Margolin. So it really started with the good, like intellectual mentors, this experimental project. And we have been dealing with many issues, but since last year, we started to look into this idea of politics of nature, and particularly focusing from the philosophy of Bruno Latour and Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, and looking into design, and particularly design for social innovation, and see how this, like theoretical framework shaped by the last work of Latour and de la Bella Casa could help us in order to move some steps further within our design practices. As Paola was mentioning, this new series started last year. It started by looking into anthropology and bringing this tradition also in dialogue with the thinking of Bruno Latour and Maria Puig de la Bella Casa. Particularly our guests were Arturo Escobar and Tim Ingold. And we continued also within looking into anthropology also in the Participatory Design Conference in Manizales. We organized a philosophy talk with Arturo Escobar, and we had the privilege to get a conversation with Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser, looking into more pluriversal understandings of ontologies and relationality. I will also just mention that we will continue working on these issues. We will continue next year with the PhD students, but we will continue also in the next 2 weeks. The 7th of July, we will have a conversation at CNI together with Emanuele Coccia and his book on the metaphysics of mixture. And then we will have also a philosophy talk guested with the Nordes 2021, talking about the concept of rewarding. So just this to give a brief framework of the work that we are doing. So now I leave the floor to Anna Linda to go deeper into the program of today.
Thank you, Virginia. Hello, everyone. I will briefly present you the program in order to follow all the conversation that we will have this afternoon or morning according to your time zone. So we will start the framing, the conversation with a recorded contribution by Laura Forlano, Associate Professor of Design at the IIT Institute of Design in Chicago. And we will then open up the conversation towards the central in a contribution of today by Alder, Keleman, Saxena, that is an environmental psychologist and co-editor of the Feral Atlas. So she will widely presenting us the Feral Atlas project, and she will launch also the 7 keywords, 7 theory keywords that we will focus on during the conversation that we will have today. After these 2 framing the conversation contribution, we will have some specific contribution trying to answer to these 2 framings by Laura Forlano itself, so to create this internal discussion, even though through recorded contribution, and then hopefully we will have a live conversation with our speakers. So Delfina Fantini von Ditmar, Daniela Rosner, and Gabrielle Benabdallah. After this contribution, also that will, of course, build up the conversation towards what has been launched at the very beginning. We will open up the conversation with all of you. So everyone that would like to join to provide us some ideas and reflection is welcome. And I will shortly leave the floor to my colleague Francesco Vanessa that will present you a brief activity that they will run during the talk, that is a live mapping, and they will launch this live mapping and presenting us also what they will do in the next 2 hours at the end of all the conversation.
Okay, wonderful, Anna Linda. Thank you very much for being always so concise, and you gave the overview of the program. But now we then leave the floor to Vanessa and Francesco to explain a bit a designerly work that they have been working at in these past weeks in order to enable also the understanding of the complexity and of the conversation today for our PhD students and for all the participants.
So thank you. Here is Vanessa, and I will just give you some rules of the game. So we invite all of you to go on Instagram and to follow the DESIS Phil Talks. And over there you will see a first map and in particular a glossary of grounding concepts for the more than human framework, and in particular from the perspective of the Feral Atlas. And these concepts are presented in an interconnected network to each other, so they are interconnected, and so you can see, we try to visualize this connection, and also we invite all of you to use this map as a theoretical canvas, and we will be using that during the contributions, so we will be adding some more concepts to this canvas. So we will have, if you go on Instagram, you will see all the key concepts. Each post is a key concept. And if you swipe, you will see the definition of the words that you can find on Instagram. So, and sometimes it's 2 swipes because the definition is a little bit longer. And so that's it. I will leave the floor to Virginia, I think.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. So very briefly, I just wanted to introduce you a bit the topic that we're talking about today, which is, of course, a huge topic, and we will have Alder introducing it much better than I will do. But the meaning is really like to give an idea of the complexity and how this Feral Atlas project is brought into relationship with this idea of more than human futures. So starting from this book, so The Mushroom at the End of the World from Anna Tsing, which is of course key also for the Feral Atlas project. If you look at the title, it says Mushroom at the End of the World on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. So indeed, this is a very poetic way to frame the Anthropocene. And, thinking about the Anthropocene, there's something that scares us and that challenges us as designers. And the first risk we have there is probably to imagine Anthropocene as a sort of unified, universal, monotonic, like thing. And to look at it from a solutionist perspective, like we are designer, there is a challenge, and we want to address a solution. And what we want to warn you, perhaps, or to raise as a question today, is the risk of doing so. Because if we look at an Anthropocene from a solutionist perspective, we actually fall back into thinking in an anthropocentric way. And if we believe that somehow our anthropocentric behavior are being co-responsible of what we call the Anthropocene, then perhaps we have to think in different terms and to step beyond this thinking in order to really address the Anthropocene from a less mystified perspective. So basically, we need really to think or rethink our design practices from within the ontological turn, as our colleague Arturo Escobar would frame, and rethink also the epistemological framework from which we design. So to step beyond, to go beyond, to step outside. And of course, there are many different ways to step beyond, to step outside of an anthropocentric perspective. And it's not my ambition to frame them all or to name them all, but just to mention some of those beyond that perhaps we should think about. So basically, when we look at this capitalist ruin, we still look at them from a very anthropocentric perspective, but perhaps we should learn to acknowledge that something also can happen, something positive and unexpected could happen from this capitalist ruin. And thinking about going beyond would also mean go beyond the teleological idea of time and embrace indeterminacy, embrace ecologies of time, embrace open-handedness. It also might mean to go beyond the unified idea of space, a quantifiable idea of space, and engage with the different situations in which we happen to design. To go beyond would mean also perhaps to go beyond dichotomies between subject and object, human and nature, human and built environment, artifacts, technology, and really embracing relationality. And for embracing a relationality, perhaps we need to allow ourselves to be vulnerable to others and to let ourselves be contaminated through transformative encounters. To go beyond might also mean to go beyond a presumed idea of universalist knowledge, right? A knowledge that can understand and unwrap the complexity of reality, and instead look into more situatedness and pluriversals way of knowing. It might also mean to go beyond the Western-centric idea of logocentrism, right? We always use words and rationality, and perhaps we need to engage with more bodily and performing ideas of knowledges. But most of all, to go beyond might mean for us as designer to go beyond the tendency to over-design. So to go beyond the tendency of overact as designers and perhaps reconsider in a humble way our own design practices as arts of noticing, as Anna Tsing also frames. So basically noticing not only what's there, but also what it's not there yet, or what could be there. So in other words, noticing prefigurative forms of multi-species world making. So other ways of imagining living together in capital and surviving together in capitalist ruins. In other ways, we could frame this as a prefigurative forms of politics, of world making together in a collaborative way, also beyond the human. And you know, those ways of politics, those ways of being together, of surviving together, are somehow already potentially present there, but they are unexpressed. And so perhaps our role there as designer could be to help some of those potentialities to be coming into being. And of course, there you see the link with More Than Human Futures, because More Than Human Future is perhaps one of the moments in our design practices in which we are more trying to explore this art of noticing political potentialities. And it's a way for us to envision a potential role in designing future that are able to question and anticipate those latent and unexpected potentials for multi-species survival, to imagine beyond our anthropocentric expectation as good as possible life for humans and beyond in the capitalist ruins. So in other words, to work in a anticipatory way, in a political way. And in order to do so, of course, those futures might mean that they need to challenge all the preconceptions that have been listing. So they need to go beyond this preconception on, you know, ruins just being ruins and have no potentials. They need to go beyond the preconceptions of work in a teleological way, to have a unified idea of space, to think in dichotomic terms, to think in logocentric way, to imagine, you know, an epistemological idea of knowledge, which is reducing the complexity of and over-reducing the complexity of reality into strict categories of knowledge. And also this idea that we always need to solve something. So basically, designing More Than Human Futures could be an antidote for us as designers in order to prevent this solutionist kind of attitude towards the Anthropocene, and to raise the right question about the Anthropocene. In a sense, to enrich our thinking as designers, and to consider those futures as political futures, by quoting again Anna Tsing, anticipatory forms of politics that are in a sense also an anticipatory form of aesthetics. And I think if we do this, if we consider designing More Than Human Futures as a way to engage with different epistemologies, then we can really also, you know, engage as designers beyond solutionism and have another attitude towards the Anthropocene. So it can be, in a sense, a way for us also to explore more down to earth, to quote Bruno Latour, way for being designers, and to be humble and to engage with relationality in a much deeper way in our practices. Of course, to do so, we need to look into other epistemologies. We cannot just stay within the epistemological model that has been moving design for many years, and that have most of all moving design as solutionism for many years. We know there are many different names for designing, many different epistemologies, that we can comprise when designing, and we are starting to explore this in the philosophy talk. For instance, in the conversation with Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blaser, and Arturo Escobar, particularly focusing on epistemology of the South. And I think today what our ambition is really to have a glance at the epistemologies that are opened in the Feral Atlas project and learn from there, you know, all those beyond that we need to engage with and how this can inform and create an epistemological framework for designing more than human futures and to enrich our way of thinking and acting as designers. So here I leave the floor to Laura Forlano because I think we are so privileged to have her helping us to frame this whole conversation on more than human design and particularly more than human futures. And then we will go to Alder that will, you know, like enrich us with presenting us all these keywords and this alternative epistemological framework that might help us in order to really think in a critical way how to make more than human futures.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Forlano, an associate professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology. And today I'm going to give an overview of more than human theory. So I go by she, her pronouns. I identify as white, middle class, highly educated, living with a disability, privileged, Italian American. I think I'm human, but I also write from the perspective of the disabled cyborg. And I work at the Institute of Design, which was founded in 1937 by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy of the Bauhaus School, which is why we're known as the new Bauhaus. So today, as I mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of some of the theories and ideas that might take us beyond the human and contribute to this more than human way of thinking. And I've written about this in 2 articles, one on posthumanism and design, and the other on decentering the human in design. So some of the key questions that are asked by these papers and in this literature are really, you know, what are the boundaries around the human and non-human, and in what ways are they getting transgressed and challenged in new ways? And how are capabilities, agencies, and power distributed across humans, machines, and natural systems? What kinds of new knowledges are needed to design for this problem? And how are ethics, values, responsibilities, and notions of justice reflected in our design process? So I'll start with Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which was published in 1991. This contribution was really important because Haraway argues that there are a number of ways in which the boundaries around the human, the animal, and the machine are being challenged. And her cyborg, she writes, is our ontology. It gives us our politics. So writing against, you know, Western Enlightenment liberal notions of the human, which very much separate the human from nature, the cyborg and also her companion Species Manifesto are ways to complicate and transgress those boundaries. So next, the science and technology studies field, and in particular, actor network theory and Bruno Latour's work. The argument here is that humans and non-humans share agency, and we participate together in shaping of issues. And he writes that in the 1980s, theorists were trying to understand the role of things and objects in science and technology studies in particular. Next, feminist new materialism, and particularly the strand based on anti-humanist philosophies of subjectivity. Rosie Brodati writes that critical post-humanism takes racism, sexism, colonialism, classism, and other isms seriously as part of the history and present conditions that have been created by the Western Enlightenment. Next, object-oriented ontology. OOO puts things at the center of being, writes Ian Bogost. We humans are elements, but not the sole elements of philosophical interest. And non-representational geography. Here, Nigel Thrift's work is relevant. He writes that new sensing technologies construct the world as a surface and continuing this motion, a world almost always there and elastic. So he creates new understandings of human subjectivity based on this mobile subject. And lastly, probably the most techno-deterministic strand of thinking is transhumanism. W. Patrick McRae writes that this concept refers to the transitional human, or the time when humans will be transcended through, transcend our biology through technology with biotech and computational enhancement. So that was a very quick overview of a lot of diverse theory from a range of different disciplines, but I wanted to mention a word of caution. In particular, some of the critiques of posthumanism and the more than human. So there's a line of thinking that says that while posthumanism is trying to engage with the limitations of Western Enlightenment thinking, that posthumanism becomes a new kind of abstraction, a new kind of universalizing and totalizing narrative that ultimately colonizes, erases, and dehumanizes, in particular, female, Black, disabled, and Indigenous bodies. So I'll just give a quick overview of that here. So some of the work that we might think of in the design field, such as these books, engage specifically with questions around power, hierarchy, intersectionality, embodiment, context, pluriversal thinking, and really question universality, individuality, and objectivism from science, which is really embedded in our design practice. Next, radical humanism from critical race studies and Black studies. I'll just read a couple of quotes. For example, Alexander Wahelier writes that concepts of the cyborg and posthuman largely do not take into account race as a constituent category in thinking about the parameters of humanity. And Zakiya Iman Jackson in Becoming Human writes that in complementary but highly distinct ways, the literary and visual texts that she analyzes articulate being human in a manner that neither relies on animal objection nor reestablishes liberal humanism as the authority on being human. Instead, they creatively respond to the animalization of Blackened being by generating a critical praxis of being, paradigms of relationality and epistemologies that alternatively expose, alter, or reject not only the racialization of the human-animal distinction found in Western science and philosophy, but also challenge the epistemic and material terms under which the specter of animal life acquires its authority. What emerges from this questioning is an unruly sense of being, knowing, feeling existence, one that necessarily disrupts the foundations of the current hegemonic mode of the human. Next, looking to disability studies, and in particular, Sarah Hendren's new book in the field of design, really the question around the ways in which ideal notions of the human body have been created. So she writes, in the absence of a norm, historically, any human body was just a shadow of the admirable perfection of superhuman bodies, the ones that gods and goddesses or other heroes possessed. The emergence of modern statistics shifted the point of comparison from lofty abstraction that no one was expected to achieve to a side-by-side analysis, assessing normal by observing people relative to one another. So I think looking to disability studies, we can learn a lot about the nature of the human as embedded in human-centered design practice and what it might mean to develop alternative and crypt notions of what human bodies are. And lastly, Decolonize Futures. I think here it's really interesting to focus on questions of autonomy, in particular, the ways in which Indigenous writing, thinking of the work of Arturo Escobar, for example, accounts for the redistribution of power, land, and resources, In the design field, some of this engagement has come from the Decolonizing Design Manifesto, a very short piece put together by Ahmed Ansari, Luisa Prado, and many others. There's also an interesting perspective on thinking about nonlinear time and the ways in which Western-centric notions of time shape our design practice. And I'll mention that Zoe Todd argues that the rush to engage with the Anthropocene has been a way of gentrifying discourse, and that this risks, once again, colonizing, universalizing, and totalizing. So that's just my brief overview. You can read a little bit more detail about all of these bodies of theory in some of my current and upcoming writing. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much, Laura. I think it's really a suggestion to all our students to go through those papers that Laura pointed to us. They're really very comprehensive and gives really an idea of what's out there in this conversation. And now we leave the floor to Alder. You see she's here with us, but we have a pre-recorded video in which there's all the presentation, and then she will be alive and kicking for the conversation with us.
Hello, my name is Alder Keleman Saxena. I am an environmental anthropologist, and I am one of the co-editors of Atlas Anthropocene. I am also a research faculty member at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. And I am a researcher additionally at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. So I've titled my talk today, Feral Atlas in 7 Theory Keywords. I put an asterisk next to the word 7 because, as I'm sure many of you would identify with, words beget more words. So we'll talk about more than 7 sort of theoretical concepts over the course of the talk. But I thought that this list of keywords might be a useful way to anchor the talk, thinking about the ongoing PhD seminar that this talk forms a part of. So let's just start with a simple descriptive question. What is Feral Atlas? Feral Atlas is a digital project. It was published online by Stanford University Press in the fall of 2020. It's interactive. That means it's clickable. As you move through the project, you can explore it yourself. It is multimedia, so it consists not only of written texts, but also of visual elements, including static drawings and video. It also has sound, so it engages all of those different mediums. It's an environmental humanities project, so it's talking about big pictures about the environment, and it integrates the work of more than 79 field reports written by not only scholars in the humanities and the social sciences, but also natural scientists, and activists and artists. It is an open access project. You can access it freely, and I very much hope that you will. And last, it also has a theoretical component. It has about 40 framing essays written not only by the editorial team, but also by leading thinkers in science and Anthropocene studies. I will take a moment to just brag a little bit. We recently found out that Feral Atlas was awarded an independent publisher book award. We took a gold medal in the best adult nonfiction informational ebook category for 2020, and that's an honor that we feel very proud of. Just a little bit more about who put Feral Atlas together. So the editorial team, the editors of Feral Atlas, consist of Anna Singh, the author of The Mushroom at the End of the World and the book Friction, Jennifer Deeger, based at James Cook University, who is a visual anthropologist, myself, that's me in the bottom left corner, and Feifei Zhu, who is an artist and architect, currently based in the UK. The project was sponsored primarily by the Danish Research Council through the larger project Aarhus University Research on the Anthropocene. It also had some funding from James Cook University and from Northern Arizona University, and there were over 100 people who contributed to putting the project together, including authors and contributors of individual entries, but also the people who made the project, who made the website, and who contributed purpose-drawn art or purpose-filmed art for to put the site together. So some of the key names are listed there. And in a nutshell, Feral Atlas tells the stories of what we think of as feral entities, which are beings, whether living or non-living, which act in relationship with human-built infrastructures to develop behaviors that exceed human design or control. You can see some images of some of these kinds of entities at the bottom of the screen: carbon dioxide, coffee rust, fungus, antibiotics, anti-fouling paint, or invasive species like these insects, the emerald ash borer being one of them. And if you haven't had the chance yet, I would really encourage you to spend some time exploring the project at www.feralatlas.org. Or there's also a short overview video, which the team that made the World Around Festival in New York just this past year put together about the project. It's about 20 minutes long, and I think it does a really excellent job of giving an overview of some of the project, the concepts, and also the content. So I said I would talk about Feral Atlas in terms of 7 theory keywords, 7 and a bit, that is. And this slide lists the keywords that I want to cover. The first of these is Anthropocene. The second is feral, and we'll talk a little bit about agency and agility in relationship to that. The third is infrastructure, and we'll talk a little bit about materiality and a category of infrastructure that we sort of lovingly shorthand as tippers. The fourth is history, and there we'll talk about temporality and another category that we again shorthand as detonators. And then the last 3 words we'll talk about are patchy, situated, and the gap. And I've sort of categorized these in the blue and red colors you see, because I think of there as being a difference in the ways that we're using that first set of keywords and the second set of keywords. The first being a set of words that help us to explain what's going on, and the second category being sort of a set of arguments about knowledge making, and I suppose we could extend that to lots of other forms of making, of design, that we would see emerging from this project as sort of ways forward in the Anthropocene. So let's start with Anthropocene. What is the Anthropocene? Many of you are likely quite familiar in this, so I'll try to go through a little bit quickly. But the Anthropocene, the word Anthropocene emerged from a discussion in geology, from the International Union of Geological Scientists specifically. And essentially it is a conversation about the question of whether there should be a new geologic epoch or chronostratigraphic unit declared to recognize this period of intense human influence on the planet. And the argument is that human activity sometime at some period in the recent past, and we'll talk about that in just a second, has left such extensive signatures on the planet that they can be seen in the stratigraphy, in layers of rock and ice. More recently, there was a vote to recognize the term Anthropocene as a formal stratigraphic unit, so it has effectively been recognized. And currently, among geologists, there's research ongoing about where precisely to locate the start date of the Anthropocene. The bigger picture is that this term has been taken up from geology and has been adopted in lots of different arenas of discourse, including the social sciences, the humanities, and also sort of popular environmental conversations. I think that's pretty well captured in the title of this article, "The Anthropocene, Are Humans Now Overwhelming the Great Forces of Nature?" This came out in the mid to early 2000s. And it was a collaboration between natural and social scientists looking at this question of what's happening in this period of human influence with the onset of industrialization, and also the quote unquote great acceleration that's taken place in the last 70 years. So the larger question is, how do we think about human environment relationships? How do we think about humans' place in nature and on the planet in this time when when there's a period of ongoing and massive environmental change? I said we'd talk about the start date of the Anthropocene. This is a table that comes out of an article published by geographers Lewis and Maslin in 2015, and they went through a series of possible start dates for the Anthropocene, ranging from the mass megafauna extinctions that took place from 50,000 to 10,000 years before present, to these more recent signals of nuclear weapon detonation or persistent industrial chemicals in the environment. The Anthropocene Working Group took these as sort of their major potential start points for thinking about where to put the pin of the beginning of the Anthropocene as a period. In Feral Atlas, we've taken a little bit of a different route because our project is really trying to look at the Anthropocene as socio-environmental histories intertwined. So we are taking the start date of this new and old world collision that they've periodized as 1492 to 1800. And specifically what's important about that, the place where you could sort of measure that stratigraphically, is looking at this carbon minima that's detectable around 1610. And effectively, what happened during that period is that with the contact between Europeans and the American continents, Europeans brought diseases that Native American groups had no immunity to, and there was a genocide scale event that killed about 90% of the Native American population very soon after that first period of contact. That carbon minima then is the result of carbon being reabsorbed from the atmosphere when people stopped farming and farmlands began to go fallow after that mass reduction of population resulting from European contact with the Americas, or European invasion of the Americas, which is the term that we've chosen to adopt in Feral Atlas. So this is one of the ways that our project is trying to think about the Anthropocene as this process of social and environmental history intertwining over time. I'll just note the term Anthropocene has generated a lot of debate. I think these two covers of articles that were published in The Atlantic are sort of indicative of this. The first, the Anthropocene is a joke on geological timescales. Human civilization is an event, not an epoch. So critiquing the idea that we need to have a term to talk about human influence, this time period of human influence on the planet. And then by the same article, by the same author, sometime later, what made me reconsider the Anthropocene, whether our civilization is transient or not, its effects on the living world will last forever. So this is an article that the same author wrote after going back and talking with some of those members of the Anthropocene Working Group and sort of rethinking what the potential long-term effects of human impact during this time period may be. Within the social sciences, the term has also been the subject of a lot of critique. And I'll just highlight two sort of prominent observations among these. One problem with the term Anthropocene is that using that concept uncritically really overemphasizes the power and the agency of humans as a species. It overemphasizes the capacity of humans to sort of make our own destiny, when in fact we should probably be thinking about all of the ways that we may not be in charge of our destinies and should be sort of taking a precautionary principle toward stewardship of the environment. And another problem with the term Anthropocene is that it risks lumping all that is human into a single category without recognizing the major differences that come about in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of nationality, when we think about the development of environmental impacts over the last 500 years. So these are 2 points that I mentioned because they're also part of what we have wanted to have Feral Atlas offer a little bit of a, I don't want to say corrective to, because one project can't correct everything, but maybe an example for how we might think about an Anthropocene that is differentiated, or as I'll talk about later, an Anthropocene that is patchy, that we can think of this period of mass environmental change without washing away issues of the power and agency of humans or other species, or of differences of race, class, and nationality. This brings me to the term feral, which is also another one of our key keywords to think with in Feral Atlas. We use the term feral to talk about all of these sorts of non-human, or sometimes more than human meaning that they act in conjunction with human activities, more than human entities that shape this period of time that we are referring to as the Anthropocene. So some examples of these are, as you saw on a previous slide, carbon dioxide, coffee rust fungus, antibiotics, anti-fouling paint, insects like the emerald ash borer. And we have, as I mentioned earlier, the 79 field reports, which make up the meat of the atlas, are built around these entities. So when thinking about the kinds of species that we think of as feral, a really easy conceptual starting point is to think about invasive species. There are a few entries in Feral Atlas that are about invasive species, and I think one of the ones that sticks in my mind the most is an entry by biologist Michael Hadfield called "Snails That Eat Snails." And this entry tells the story, a really tragic story of extinction, of a series of events that happened in Hawaii and in many of the Pacific Islands. There was an introduction of the giant African snail, which you see in the top left picture, early in the 1900s. And that snail was a pest. It ate lots of things it wasn't supposed to eat, and people didn't like it. So as a biological control, this second snail in the bottom left picture, called Ugandina rosea, or the rosy wolf snail, among other species, was introduced as an attempt to control and wipe out the giant African snail. It turned out that the rosy wolf snail was very good at eating other snails, but not necessarily the target snail that it was introduced to try to suppress. Instead, the introduction of the rosy wolf snail and other snails led to the near extinction of Catanella tree snails. So on the right-hand side, you see pictures of these small snails with beautiful shells, which have gone near extinct due to predation by these other snails. So this is an example of a more than human creature, right? It's a human action that has introduced both the giant African snail and the rosy wolf snail, but that has turned out to be uncontainable. It's, you could think it's gone feral, and it's had these knock-on ecological effects that have then limited the livability of Hawaii for other snail species. So this is how we're thinking about feral creatures in Feral Atlas, or feral entities. We're thinking about them as entities that have feral qualities, is what we've termed them, traits that arise in the relationship between that entity and some sort of human-built infrastructure, and that lead to an out-of-control or feral activity. Because the project is a project that works on sort of interactive navigation and categorization, we've come up with these sort of set of conceptual categories for navigating this, this massive information, this variegated massive information that comes in through these 79 field reports. So some of the feral qualities that we're working with are things that are accelerated by climate change, things that are creatures of conquest, that are brought along as introductions by conquering powers, industrial stowaways, and entities that have legacy effects, so things that take effects that take place over long periods of time, entities that really like human disturbance, entities that need some other entity to be sort of bound up with to have the kind of effect that they have, entities that develop superpowers, sort of souped up, jacked up capacities that somehow make them affect their environments in new ways, entities that thrive with the plantation conditions, so specifically entities that interact with agriculture, entities that create toxic environments, or entities that, like the example I just gave you, like the rosy wolf snail, are uncontainable. And these kinds of feral qualities are what we might think of as more than human agency. Another way we might think of these are that these entities have developed novel agilities. They've developed something that helps them to act and interact in an environment in a new way that gives them a leg up. The word agilities, I think, has an advantage because agency, unless you're steeped in debates about the agency of the material world. Agency may have also for some people a sort of implication of sentience, of conscious action. And agility also helps get at this idea that, that action to take an effect in the world doesn't always need to be sentient. So one example that I think with when I think about agility is the release of mercury from mining, and in the entry that we have in Feral Atlas, the mining case that is discussed is mining in China, but that then rises into the air or falls into the ocean in microparticulates. And then in this case, what happens is that same mercury ends up traveling across the world to the coast of California, and through sort of being brought up into fog through chemical reactions, then ends up deposited on the California coastline. So that to me is sort of the idea of agility is sort of evocative of what's happening in that kind of case. So the final point I would make on this is that these kinds of feral effects that arise out of the interaction between an entity and an infrastructure are, they're not incidental to the Anthropocene, but rather they are constituent of this concatenation of environmental disruptions that, that from the perspective of somebody living in 2021, characterize the Anthropocene. And I'd like to move on to talking a little bit now about the word infrastructure as a keyword, and then relating that to these ideas of materiality and tippers. In conjunction with feral entities, part of what Feral Atlas argues is that imperial and industrial infrastructures effectively create new ecological conditions. They create new conditions that arise together. And although the word infrastructure has been taken in other social science circumstances to refer to more of an ideational sphere of networks and some of the less concrete parts of sociality, we in this project wanted to define infrastructures in very, very concrete and material terms. So for us, infrastructures start with things that are material, with things that are sort of tangible, touchable, that modify landscapes in very sort of concrete and earthy ways. And some of them then go on to have larger implications that are social and cosmological. But we wanted to start with these very, very concrete modifications of the earth. So I think a good way actually to illustrate that is to show you two short, we think of them as video poems that show the elements of the kind of infrastructure that that was interesting to us in this project. So I'll start with one. So as you've seen, this is a short video that looks at transport across a landscape in an industrial extractive landscape in northern Chile. And roads are the kind of concrete infrastructure, roads and transport infrastructure are the kind of infrastructure that we're thinking of as having world-changing effects. That is, a key part of this project. I want to show you one more short video poem that is we've categorized as crowd. This is another. I'll talk about these categories in just a second. And as you can see, I should have mentioned I've switched screens so that I'm now looking at the Feral Atlas site. So we are inside of the atlas, and I'm showing you these poems from inside of the site. So here we are. Let me pull this back to the right starting point. And here is one of the videos for crowd. So, sorry, repeating again, that was a little shorter. So, as you can see here, this is an industrial chicken factory that is serving as a sort of icon of this idea of crowding. So, I mentioned that I would talk about categories, and we've used these very sort of material and concrete forms of infrastructure to think about tipping points. And what we mean by tipping points, and we've shorthanded that as tippers, is we're thinking about the kinds of infrastructural interventions that lead to some sort of state change, some sort of change that shifts systems to a new way of behaving and interacting with each other. Not just environmental systems, but also social systems. And these are infrastructures which emerge out of specific historical and economic contexts. So, they don't just come about on their own, but they grow out of, for example, the push toward industrial agriculture. And you see the four images of some other video. These are associated with the tipper grid, which refers to plantation style agriculture, monoculture, crop efficiency. We have these are the categories of infrastructure that we've worked with in Feral Atlas. One is burn, referring to things that emerge from the burning of fossil fuels. Another is crowd, so thinking about the crowding together of animals and people, and what kinds of things, what kinds of new feral qualities can emerge from that. Another is dump, thinking about what happens when you've got all this stuff that you don't know what to do with and you just dump it somewhere. Toxicity, for example, is one thing that emerges from that. Grid, as I've already described, is associated with industrial agriculture. Pipe specifically refers to the movement of water or the rechanneling of water in ways that facilitate industrial commerce. Smooth and speed, as is pretty obvious, refers to ways to make transport faster and allow it to move larger masses of goods. And then take, this last category, refers to all the kinds of things that people take along with them when they move from one place to another. So again, we could think about the rosy wolf snail or many other invasive species, both intentionally and unintentionally introduced as examples of this. And just to make sure I don't do short shrift to materiality, tippers, to some extent, if you want to think about a larger theoretical lineage for this, this is a way that Feral Atlas is incorporating and responding to some of the questions that have been prominent in social science theory over the last 10 or 15 years, that are turning away from discourse as a sort of defining framing for understanding social interaction, or for understanding how history develops, and beginning to think again with these very concrete and material things like roads, dams, fossil fuels, and thinking about how the intermingling of those material things and other social processes effectively generates assemblages of sociality or socio-environmental interactions that are of concern in this period. So I'll move on from there to history. And, you know, history is a big term, so give me a little bit of affordance on this one, because what I really want to get to here is the specifics of how we're using the idea of history in Feral Atlas. In Feral Atlas, we have talked about history in terms of what we refer to as Anthropocene detonators. That's just what it sounds like. It's processes that detonate or set off something that is constitutive of the Anthropocene, that set off these feral qualities, these new agilities of feral entities in relationship to infrastructures. And we have periodized these. It's a rough periodization. It's more conceptual than historical periodization as invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. So these are if you'll give me a broad use of the word history, these are historical processes that repeat in some way across time and space. Another way you could think about them is as founding conjunctures that have world-making or world-disrupting effects. And the way I'd like to talk about these is in the digital project, we have a sort of part of the project that you pass through as an interactive user, which are these detonator worlds. They're a series of 4 very detailed murals that were drawn by Feifei Zhu, one of our co-editors, who's also an architect and artist. And these detonator worlds try to kind of bring together some of the concepts that we have tried to crystallize in these four historical detonators. So the one that you're looking at now, this is a screenshot of the Empire detonator world. And I'll apologize because I see now that I'm looking at it, as I've taken the screenshot and put it on my own screen, that it's a little bit pixelated. And in fact, I think I can switch screens and see, maybe I can bring you into the, yes, this is the correct one. So when you arrive at these on the site, you can actually zoom in quite close, and they are very, very detailed. So you can see this one is sort of drawn from the view of perhaps a colonizer standing on a hill. And you can see scenes of different processes that took place under the colonial empires of particularly the 1800s, but stretching before and after that as well. So here's a soldier guarding a field of poppies. Here's a set of surveyors marking off land in a teak plantation, a colonizer shooting an elephant. We have the construction of dams and bridges, and here moving up towards the coast, we have a natural history museum and a slave ship with enslaved people departing the coast for likely for the Americas. And one of the things that you'll notice in these drawings is that they also sample, with the permission of the artists in question, they sample art by people who are largely by indigenous artists who have made their own artistic commentaries on these processes. This reference to contract farming is one of those pieces, and here also this image of a slave ship is one that is a historical image that that they incorporated into this landscape. So I wanted to just sort of talk about this in terms of temporality. Materiality and temporality are words that are often sort of discussed next to each other. And I think one way that we could think about temporality is that it's the work, the sort of socio-material work that happens through processes that unfold over time. And that's what we've tried to sort of capture in these detonator worlds. Another thing that we've tried to capture is that co-temporalities matter, meaning that there are many processes happening at the same time and they happen at different tempos. So these kinds of overlaps or concatenations of events that unfold over time, they also matter for the way that the Anthropocene develops. So this brings me to a sort of turning point in these 7 theory keywords. We've talked through Anthropocene, feral, infrastructure, and history. And I'll turn now to talking about these sort of argument-oriented keywords, patchy, situated, and the gap. So in this last set of keywords, I am switching to some arguments about how we might understand the Anthropocene and about how we who are engaged in making, whether that's making of knowledge or making of material things, might try to think differently in order to move forward. Let me start with the word patchy. So one of the arguments in Imperial Atlas is that we should think about the Anthropocene as patchy. It's all too easy to think about this period of geological history, this period that we're living in, and I think particularly a moment that is defined by climate change as something that is somehow uniform and hegemonic, and that is because it's planetary in scope, it must be the same everywhere. But part of what we are trying to argue, drawing from the material in Imperial Atlas, is that that's not actually an accurate or a helpful way to think about these socio-environmental processes that we're experiencing. So rather than an undifferentiated and earth-wide effect, we can think of the Anthropocene as being made up of non-human responses to imperial industrial infrastructure, which is distributed unevenly across the earth, right? Dams and roads and transport, all of these kinds of things are distributed in uneven ways. And one of the most interesting entries in Imperial Atlas, I think, in this regard, is one by the author, the scientist Jan Zalasiewicz, who's part of the Anthropocene Working Group, and Sophie Milon, who is an artist, pointing out that not even carbon dioxide is evenly distributed across the earth. And this piece of artwork that you see in front of you is Sophie Milon's representation of that, depicting the fact that carbon dioxide accumulates at lower levels closer to the ground, right? So even like within the ground we experience, there are different levels of CO2. So Imperial Atlas makes the argument that the Anthropocene should be thought of as patchy. The next kind of what to do keyword is situated. And situated is it's a term with a long theoretical lineage. We could trace it far back in the past and also widely in the present. So we could think about past and current discussions of phenomenology, for example, as ways of thinking about situated approaches to research. We could also relate this word to feminist theorists, including Donna Haraway, thinking about how knowledge is situated within the perspective of an individual. In Imperial Atlas, one of the things that we really tried to do was make sure that each of these field reports has a situated perspective, that it's a report from somewhere as opposed to a report from everywhere. So we are trying through these field reports to show that that perspectives on the Anthropocene, even if we're talking about planetary processes, there are also really important particularities to pay attention to using the lens of infrastructures and feral entities. So you might say that in Feral Atlas, what we mean by situated is the view from a patch. And I had an example that I was going to show here, but I think I'm running a little short on time, so I won't go all the way through it. But for thinking about what a situated perspective on environmental change might look like, I would really strongly recommend taking a look at the entry on cane toads, which is an invasive species in Australia that has wiped out many other creatures, including the goanna. And this is an entry that was written by an Aboriginal contributor named Russell Nagdali Ashley, and it is accompanied by a piece of original art depicting the defense of the cane toad. I can, as long as I'm talking about it, I'll pull it up very quickly so you can see the original artwork here. And if you scroll down on this page, you'll also see that there is an audio file, which is his worry song for Bitjai, worry song for the goanna. Maybe I'll play just a couple of seconds of it, and then I won't play the entire thing. So what we've tried to do with this entry and with many of the entries in the project is to demonstrate how this process that we could think of through sort of the lens of science also has a very human and personal impact, and that we can see these processes from that view from a patch perspective, from a sort of toes in the dirt perspective. And I should mention that this is one of the unique affordances, I think, of doing a digital project, because there are many of the entries where all of the entries have some sort of multimedia component, but there are many of the entries where there is animation or film or sound that accompany a written text. And in fact, there are some entries that are built entirely around visuals or entirely around sound. So if that speaks to you, I really encourage you to spend some time looking through. So the last piece that I want to talk about is this idea of the gap. And the gap is a concept that comes from Anna Singh's 2005 book, Friction. And effectively, I won't go on at length, but it refers to spaces that are sort of gaps in hegemonic universal narratives or hegemonic widespread processes that allow for some kind of counter-hegemonic potential to emerge. There's an essay at the end of the Atlas in the reading room called A View from a Patch on a Material Phenomenology of Climate Change, which is one that I wrote, which thinks about this idea of the gap as in the context of what should we think, what should we do about climate change, how should we understand climate change. And the thought that I'll leave you with, and forgive me, I've written it out here, so I didn't go wrong on it, is that for people who are in knowledge making, and maybe for those of you who are working in design, attunement to these kinds of gaps, it might mean trying to cultivate situated knowledges and practices that explicitly include the more than human. It might mean trying to cultivate the kinds of things that see human as differentiated and acknowledge trajectories of historical injustice in both of their human and their more than human effects. And it might also mean trying to find approaches that foster new ways of relating within our particular surroundings, both among people and with more than human worlds. So taking all of this, this understanding of the Anthropocene as patchy and situated, and working with that sort of patchy situated perspective within this large and sweeping period of change, and trying to find a way to move forward that pushes beyond business as usual. So that's what I have for you today. I am very much looking forward to the comments and the discussion, and I'll leave you with some contact details and the hope that you will explore the project. Thanks so much for your time.
So thank you so much, Alder. Now we'll jump to Laura Forlano, which is the first contributor, right? Because basically we asked for contributors today to really look into, so that's why also the presentation was pre-recorded, as it works as a sort of prompt, and reflect on if and how the concepts that have been, and the key concepts that have been addressed by Alder kind of reflect also in their own thinking, and can also be generative in their own thinking in more than human design future. So we leave the floor to Laura, and afterwards to Delfina, Daniela, and Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Alder, for the wonderful prompt and set of keywords to think about. I found them very generative, and I think at the intersection of science and technology studies and design, we have this rich vocabulary emerging. And so I just wanted to offer a few thoughts and maybe some additional keywords that can spark thinking. And, you know, I have some misgivings about calling this a more than human turn, because that often denotes some kind of a paradigm shift. But if we are thinking about the more than human, here are some of the ideas or keywords that come to mind for me: experimental, imagination, possibility, speculation, indeterminacy, fissures, differences, questions, symbiosis, translations, and relations. And I just wanted to offer a couple of examples of how I see this emerging in the design field in particular. So Anab Jain, who's a speculative designer based in London with the Superflux studio, has a list of More Than Human and some wonderful projects that engage with nature and forests. And so some of these keywords around caring and gardening and nurturing, I think are really relevant here as well. And I'll just mention a couple of other projects. So what comes to mind for me when we're thinking about keywords and concepts from science and technology studies theory or from across the social sciences and humanities is how we might think about using theory as a kind of design material in itself. And I think some of these recent works in the design field talk about the role of theory in design processes. So I'll just mention a couple of projects. So Anne Galloway's More Than Human Lab was actually founded in 2010. It's one of the first design labs, I think, that used that language. And her work engages really in the living and dying together with her sheep. So she tends sheep and she very much both, takes care of them. She also slaughters them and she also eats them. And so it's a very personal, intimate encounter with the more than human that she has pioneered in her lab. Another project, Svenja Kühne, her textile farming project, Living in a Prototype, she actually built a house that has living materials forming the curtains and other parts of that building, and she's recently moved it from northern Sweden to Denmark, I believe. And so this process again of living in or living with the more than human as a design experience and as a prototype of sorts is really interesting. And lastly, I'll mention Christina Lindstrom and Usa Stahl's Unmaking Studio. One of their current projects explores plant-pollinator relationships, such as the alarming loss of pollinators, but it does it by inviting people to craft their own tools for hand pollination in order to sensitize ourselves to the complexities of pollination and imagine otherwise. So those are three projects I think that fall very well into the realm of the Feral Atlas project and Alder's provocation. So for me, making critical futures really means, making our positionality explicit, acknowledging, yes, partial and situated knowledge, thinking about these socio-technical systems and infrastructures, moving away from thinking of technologies as tools and towards thinking of them as cultures, moving away from instrumental or exploitative relationships and thinking more about relational and sort of living with. And that's what the three projects that I mentioned, I think, have in common. And, so just to kind of wrap up, the importance of the more than human in terms of relational thinking, and thinking about the ways in which the categories that we've inherited from Western Enlightenment thinking are inherently unstable and co-constructed, and thinking both about the post-humanist philosophies and theories, but also about radical humanism and what some of the other fields and disciplines can offer to our design practice. So my question I'll leave you with are really, what are the politics and aesthetics of a more than human approach to design? And how do these complicate or move us beyond binary conceptions? What kinds of materials are relevant for us to work with, including theories and ideas and concepts as materials, but also including perhaps working with technological platforms or working with living materials. And so that's what I wanted to contribute to the conversation. Thank you again for the invitation to be part of this collective conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so thank you, Laura. And we will now start with the live part with the Delfina. So Delfina, the floor is yours.
Can you see my background?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, first of all, while I'm waiting for the program to start, thank you very much, Virginia, for the invitation. And also thank you, Alder, for your very inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. And also Laura for your contribution. I think what you mentioned about the non-binary conception is actually really important. So I'm now going to respond from my practice. I am teaching in the design products department. And basically I'm gonna tell you of how I'm confronting in my practice all these keywords and provocations that Adler kindly offered today with the lecture. So my talk is called Non-Hegemonic Futures, Planet Thinking and More Than Human Approach. I'm gonna start actually with an anecdote. I am a biology, that's my BA. And as soon as I landed in science, the first thing I got to know in my own university was that a scientist back in the 70s brought this African frog, which is Xenopus levis, which is very much used in science because it has very large ovaries and also it has many oocytes, which is very useful for the design practice, was brought through the airport. And while the customs service took a lot of time to see if this frog was suitable to enter to the country or not, the frog found its way in the landscape of the airport, which was perfect, was the perfect condition for it to have kids. And what happened is that it spread the citromydiocosis, which is an infectious disease caused by the fungus Batrocidium dendrobatis. And this created a dramatic decline in the amphibian population in the country and also with the fish. So now the Chilean frog, which is the one in your right, is in extinction. So that was actually my entrance to the science itself. I also want to talk about the fact that we are never alone and this idea that our body isn't just us. More than half of our body is actually not human. 43% of the body total cell count is actually the microbiome. So as Professor Sarkis Masmanian notes, what makes us human is not only the DNA, but it's the combination of the DNA plus the DNA of our gut microbes. And because we're now in the ground of design, I am a huge fan of design, and I think there's so much to do in terms of design agency and design in this Anthropocene context, is the value of, for example, design and education. So here I have some drawings of some educational props to teach kids that humans are not only humans. We're all with these bacteria, virus, fungus, and they're not our enemies, all the opposite. A lot of them are here to help us, and they're incredibly important. And also biology should not always be this boring matter. It can also be really fun and fascinating from a very early on stage. And here design, as I said, has a really important role. I'm going to move now to this idea of the environmental injustice, which was mentioned in the presentation. And these ideas of progress are rooted in systems that are inherently toxic and that are leading us into this ecological emergency. This is affecting absolutely every ecosystem, and it's creating the pandemic with the effect of the zoonosis, it's creating inequalities, it's creating warmer effects. And all these three aspects are now issues that designers are actually dealing with the consequences and are designing for. I really like the concept of Susan Shupley from Forensic Architecture, and it's these ideas of toxic commons. As Adler noted in her presentation, the effects move across the world very unexpected. However, also these effects are distributed unequally, and usually this tends to map into existing socioeconomic pressures. For example, this is the case with the recycling. In the UK, we don't recycle here. We ship everything to Asia. China, a couple of years ago, said, no, we don't accept it anymore. And it's going now to the Philippines and Malaysia and creating severe consequences in external other countries. At the heart of this accelerating global warming lies the excessive extraction, overproduction, and disposal of necessary to support the economic growth. And this is something that for design is something that we really need to deal with, because we do extractive practice, we create this overproduction, and also things that create are the ones that they are disposed. So we need to move from product center. In the 90s, 2000, it was very popular to talk about user-centeredness, But now we're definitely in times where we start to think about planet-centeredness. And for this, we need to avoid purely thinking about the human-driven values. There are already some design studios that are talking about this beyond human-centeredness, and this is the case of Space 10. Here I have some quotes. We have grown disillusioned with the design method that puts people first and has as a result overstretched the result of our planet many times. We know that design that is not good for our planet is ultimately not good for people. Designers are not only accountable for these innovative solutions, but we are also part of the environmental collapse. So by evading these ecological implications, designers are actually complicit in the problems that we have created. So there is an urgent need to rethink the discipline, and there's plenty of room to question the discipline itself. Otherwise, we'll just keep perpetuating the problems that we have created. Now I'm going to move to a couple of, I think, very interesting design projects. This is from Cooking Sections, and it's called Isle of Skye. And this is an awareness, public engagement, and behavioral change project. And this project was about human eating habits and how they should change with the climate collapse. Food here was used as a tool to think about these larger questions. And here the main focus was the farming industry. So they would try to move in this society from farming salmon to generative architecture. So here the community has been protesting for decades due to the toxicity that is coming out of this salmon farming. For this, they developed an apprenticeship with a local school to find alternative ingredients that can be introduced to the next generations of chefs of the area, and also to rethink what can we farm around here that is actually not salmon. So all this is what they call the climavore dishes. And the big question here is the transition from the economy and the ecology from salmon farming into a small-scale polyculture with seaweed and bivalve and other elements such as oysters. And as you can see here on your right, it was not only incredibly beautiful, but it actually really involved the community. So when there was a low tide, there was a dining table holding workshops and tasting all this new menu that they thought about. And this includes residents, chefs, environmentalists, and also school kids. And when it was the high tide, this installation became a home for oysters, mussels, and seaweed. Another project that I really like and that I usually show to my students is The Anatomy of the AI System by Kate Crawford. Here, the researchers think about what's behind Alexa. So here, for example, when it comes about the manufacturers, is what's happening to the people actually ensembling this. There are neurotoxic, there are low frequencies, there are hazards of body positions, repetitive work, but also what's happening with the environment and all the components that we need to do this so-called smart technology. So this is extremely pollutant for the water, for the air, and then if you really spend time, you can see all the environmental consequences of every aspect, including the extraction of these rare earth elements that have been exponentially used with these smart technology innovations. So I'm going to here quote Liz Corbin from the book Why Material Matters, is when we began to study a material, we immediately launch into an ever more complicated system of scales and structures. And in my personal opinion, this is something that every time more design students should be involved with. And also taking it now more into an AI discussion. This AI, which seems so remote and in the cloud, actually it's very grounded in certain colonialism activities and also extractivism, and it's very traumatic with the collection code. The land is not just immaterial. So a lot of times students think the best option is to go digital. Digital has a huge footprint and it's very traumatic for the earth. So it's important to think about also these factors. What the video really made me think is about the importance of decolonizing design. And decolonizing, obviously, I think it's really important to have a look of the work that is being done by the Decolonizing Design Group. There's so many incredible projects and perspectives that is really nice to read because they really make us reflect which are the prevalent ways of thinking. So yes, we need to de-Westernize our thinking. We also need to remove ourselves from this human centricity, but also from this industrial design trajectory. I think this is actually some element that we really need to contest. And more importantly, we need to reflect upon the ground, which is this neoliberalism and the idea of exponential growth. And for this, I really think it's important to bring this idea of the degrowth movement, which criticizes this global capitalist system, which is persuading growth at all costs, exploitation, and also environmental destruction. So we need to prioritize this social and ecological well-being instead of this corporate profit, overproduction, and excess of consumption. So I think that's the main ground before we move now into bringing other elements into view. And the next step for me is, as we all know, it's incredibly important to explore the other. So we need to shift the perspective and also offer alternatives. We need to bring different epistemologies and different ontologies into design discourse, as there are so many. And for this, I think two great references is Xenodesign by Joanna Schemmer. She was a PhD student from the RCA, and also the brilliant piece of the multi-species approach of Donna Haraway about non-human in place or also design making. These new ways of seeing open new territories for understanding and for developing ecological and ethical design considerations. I'm going to show a couple of examples that really shift perspective. One is Thomas Thwaite and Goatman, how I took a holiday from being a human. Here, Thomas spent 6 days among the goats in the Alps using a set of prostheses. And this really led him to disengage a little bit of his humanness and bring a new series of insight. Also, in Sundance last year, there were a lot of projects using VR in which you can position yourself. For example, you could be a mushroom carrying out bioremediation, or you can be a bug sliding down the esophagus, or you can even be yourself watching how you breathe. And there was also another project called Animalia Sun, which put viewers in the roles of future humans and the bugs that they consume. So there is also technology to put us in other situations and see if we can learn something and then use it for future design. So all this shift in perspective and questioning, it's really important, but hopefully when we move into design ground, we need to think, what do we do with this insight that we're taking when we put ourselves in these other positions? As Laura mentioned, there's this super interesting group called Design Justice. And here I took some principles that I think that we can take from the Design Justice group, which is mainly focused in humans. But I think we can still apply this when we think about the environment, and that is the non-exploitative solutions designed to heal and empower communities, and also center these voices of who are directly impacted by the outcome of the design process. Another interesting approach for me is the theater of negotiations, which is this idea of the parliament, based on Latour's idea of the failure of past conferences and the crisis of representations. So who represents the problem at stake and the different communities affected, who represent the oceans, who represent the forests, who represent the climate refugees and extinct animals in a conference of nations. And what if the atmosphere, the soil, and the cities had its own voice in this negotiation and reduction of CO2 emissions? We really need to think about this ontological exceptionalism of human, but also I think there is some really interesting ideas of the ancestral way of thinking. And for this, I think some indigenous theory, it's really important in terms of consideration of humans and non-humans. I recently was in a talk with Ana Nasso, who's also a researcher at the RCA, and we were talking about AI and how AI is a completely different thing when you think it with indigenism. So indigenism treats kin non-humans respectfully and is based on respect and care and listening to the others, what they are saying. So these are based on relations that are mutually beneficial, and they're not based on control or one side benefiting. So these avoid this ecological catastrophe. And another book that I think it's really relevant is Radical Indigenism from Julia Watson. Here she mentions we are now on a crossroad where we can either end or continue on a narrow view of technology informed by a distance from nature, or we can acknowledge that it's just a way to live. The field of design is a pivotal moment, expanding to confront complex problems that require robust and adaptive responses. Climate change has shown us that our survival is not dependent on superiority, but upon collaboration with nature. And here she has incredible examples in the book. They're all wonderful and very well diagrammed. So innovations are designed to work with complex ecosystems and are arranged to amplify mutually beneficial interactions. So again, all based in symbiosis. And a really nice, interesting principle that I found in the book is this 7-generation principle, which is considering actions that they affect 7 generations after. And here, the name that she uses is the Great Lore of Iroquois. So I think it's really important that as designers, we actively care about the environment, the ecological design should be integral, with the perspectives included in the design process, thinking about extractive practices and manufacturing toxicity, and not design coming in the last minute to patch all what has been done. As designers, we should be questioning and rethinking. Design is a discipline that with critical understanding, skills, and tools makes changes in the world. So I want to finish this with the idea of non-hegemonic futures. So from probabilities, which is coming from this mathematical idea, to possibilities. This neoliberal system trains us to focus in the evolution of the problem rather than to revolutionize the problem itself, normalizing futures. And this goes way beyond just an upgrade or a fix of a problem, like an iPhone. It's just a little fix, a little innovation. It's not something radical. Designers need to move away from the engineering problem-solving attitude that is so prevalent in design, and more than ever, we need to inventive problems and also problem-making. So the problems need to be problematized itself. And I'm going to close with some learnings from a talk that I had last week with Moite Berjabat, who was the curator of this exhibition called Design for Different Futures. At some point in her presentation, she mentioned about how American billionaires are actually preparing themselves for the apocalypse by doing these really expensive and luxurious survival contents. So then she said, why are we more ready for the end of the world than to a different world? It's super important that we think about the future, because the future is not given and the future definitely is not singular. And here there's a lot of agency for design to reimagine and also consider where are we not looking, who are we not thinking about. And in this case, I think very appropriately for the talk, it's thinking about the human, but especially about the non-human. How can we include these other perspectives, and where in a space for education and debate where the focus can be enlarged? So that's my intervention for today.
Thank you, Delfina. I think you really picked up a lot of elements that are very dear to me personally. And I think really like this is also a bit a message in the bottle for our students today to really step beyond the problem solving and really see a possibility in designing these more than human futures in order to think otherwise and to problematize the problems. I think you were nicely putting it. And I would just certainly go to the next in line, which is the Daniela. We are a bit running out of time, but Daniela, take your time. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. Thanks very much to Virginia Tassinari and also to Ana Linda de la Rosa for the invitation and coordinating this conversation. So I'm excited to think about the politics of nature, but in a sort of a broader sense. I want to use my time today to explore this topic of multi-species collaborative survival, but really touching on Alder, Keleman, Saxena's lovely remarks, and going to sort of keep those remarks pretty brief, mine and really connected to some wider questions around complicity and completeness. So as someone working in the field of design, I am taking from Alder's comments a kind of call for thinking with both potentials and violences, and those connected particularly to material infrastructures and the pride of praxis, the sort of core of design techniques. And then there's a wider urge that I found to not only think but make space for that reflection, and to reflect in particular on the various treatments and complicities within the design field. So what I wanted to do first is sort of think about that frame of the more than human. And for me, that frame offers a kind of useful intervention, in particular in liberal humanist framings of design. So a kind of separation between designer and design, between world and us, between subjects and objects. And in that intervention, it's pointing to interconnections, and I would say incomplete ones. So as Alder and also Laura Forlano mentioned, the phrase is also retaining a kind of humanistic or human-centered complicity. So there's a more than human is also a centered human in a sense, because you're continuously bringing the human into the frame. So it's an orientation toward another entity that is always sort of orbiting right around the human condition. And what I want to suggest is we examine and trouble that relationship. And in my own work, thinking about that particular troubling in my home department or home field of human-centered design, right? There's a really interesting sort of deeper connection to a field that has oriented toward an explicit marking of human-made and occupied worlds. Now, this is ostensibly in contrast to worlds that are rife with capitalist, instrumentalist kinds of impulses and complicity. So that there is a kind of break that's trying to be established by orienting toward the human rather than the machine or the sort of socioeconomic, wider political context in which that the world is being made for and through. So a place to start in sort of complicating those relations for me is in the teaching of a more than human design practice. And in much of that work, I've found that it's too often that a practice that in which pain is perpetuated vis-a-vis ontological erasure. So this is where Black and Indigenous peoples are associated legacies of settler colonialism, chattel slavery, sealing work by Audrey Simpson, Zoe Todd, as well as others I speak to in a moment, and the sort of reproduction of progress narratives within those contexts. So that comes back to the teleological that Virginia brought up in the framing remarks. So acts of future making through human conditions then prioritizes rupture over repetition or remaking, and then it must come with the troubling of the temporal epochs, in Alder's words, where we see the possibility as incomplete, not finite, or fully determined. So incompletion here, I'm referencing Fred Moten and Stefano Harni's recent text, All Complete, which follows on other collaborations, such as Undercommons, in which they describe sort of complicity as at least two kinds of conditions. So complicity, quote, indicates a kind of falling into something, not being able to disentangle what you see as yourself from the institution and its anti-sociality, end quote. But they also contend, quote, to be complicit with others, to be an accomplice, to live in ways that always provoke conspiracy. This second use of conspiracy emphasizes our incompleteness. When you see us, you see something missing, our accomplices, or something more, our conspiracy, end quote. So this discussion kind of recalls questions that have been raised by my colleague, historian Helen Gibson, who draws from Saidiya Hartman, Calvin Warren, to think on the bounds of humanism and Blackness. And from Warren's concept of ontological terror and Hartman's theory of critical fabulation, which I've explored in its profound reshaping of design, Gibson is working through the ways that the terms like power and agency are containing but also reestablishing what Warren names this humanist fantasy, where an investigation of experiences can write out a wider examination of ontology. So to sort of close this brief provocation, I want to draw from Gibson's words to ask, what is our communal investment in a liberal humanism, right? How might our work to design or circumscribe a more than human landscape and theorize those designs work to actually, quote, reinscribe existing ontologies? And also, finally, how can we here as designers, scholars of design and on humanism, or no more than humanism, embrace, quote, a complicity to render ourselves incomplete? So I will end there and look forward to the conversations that follow. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Virginia, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So now I was just mentioning we are running a bit out of time, and but we shouldn't. I mean, I don't worry so much about it. I worry about having a conversation, right? And as you were very articulated in your provocation also to Alder, Daniela, I think perhaps Alder just want to jump in and say something before going to Gabrielle, right?
You know, I'm these are really thought-provoking comments, and I'm letting them settle a bit. I have some thoughts in response, but I might actually wait. I'll hold off until hearing Gabrielle in the interest of time, just to say this is all really generative. So thank you.
Okay, so Gabrielle, the floor is yours then.
Okay, thank you so much. I almost want to just maybe like leave the floor to the conversation now. So also happy to do that because I feel like there's so much like rich content that have been shared today already. Yeah, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, and just thank you first of all to Virginia for inviting me, and to all the great speakers who've talked so far. And so my intervention today is more on the philosophy side than on the design side, but trying to think how some of this, as Laura was mentioning, use some of these theories and ideas as materials for design. And so this intervention is about putting in dialogue two thinkers, the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon and the Cameroonese philosopher Achille Mbembe. And I think one thing that is very interesting to point out, and that the speakers have either explicitly talked about so far or pointed at in their talks, is that in this discussion on post-anthropocentric design and the ontological turn, is that one of the fundamental assumptions of traditional Western ontology is the separation between humans and their environment, between the subject and the object, which was a conceptually useful separation to modern Western epistemology as well, because essentially, how else do you know something if it's not separate from you? There's this kind of like critical distance that is so core to our intellectual and epistemological legacy. And so many philosophers have critiqued the separation between object and subject, the phenomenological tradition, among others, without ever being able to fully move past it. Daniela was mentioning Calvin Warren's ontological error, and I think that this speaks to the ongoing tentative to exit the subject-object binary and the harm that it has historically caused, that this ontological conception has historically caused. But according to Gilbert Simondon, the separation between subject and object is, in fact, not only a false separation, but the very question of their relationship is, or rather reveals, a blind spot of Western ontology. Because the terms of this relation, that is subject and object, these two terms do not precede the relation, but rather the relation constitutes them. And in other words, there are no subject and object that then enter into a relation, but the relation is what enables beingness. And so we're moving closer to, through this kind of reframing on traditional ontology, to perhaps like a relation-focused or relation-centered design approach to design. And so for Simondon, individual beings are constantly undergoing a series of what he calls operations and energetic exchanges between their structure and their milieu or their environment. And so beings in this conception are not stable, but metastable, a term that he borrows from thermodynamics to describe this kind of surplus of energy or potential energy, which is the condition of existence. The ability for all beings to constantly reshift and reconfigure their internal dynamism to a particular and ever-changing environment. And so, in other words, instead of conceiving of beings as stable identities, Simonon sees beings as energetic systems of internal resonance, quote, in quote. He writes that quote, the individual is being and relation, that it is a center of activity. And this conception, this kind of reworking of classic Western ontology is interesting when thinking about some of the ideas of Achille Mbembe. Mbembe makes the argument in his most recent book called Brutalisme that algorithmic capitalism is the latest expression of a long-standing colonialist race to exploit all the raw, so brut in French, resources of earth and of the living. And so in this perspective, Mbembe reflects on the relation between really design and politics. He talks specifically about architecture and politics, but I think it can be extended to really this relationship between the built world and politics. He writes, quote, architecture and politics are a matter of the regular arrangement of materials and bodies, a matter of quantities, volumes, expenses and measures, of distribution and modulation of force and energy, unquote. And this idea of energy is so important in Mbembe's critique that he refers to the violence of capitalism, this whole brutalist kind of politics, as a thermopolitics. And he writes that the energy of bodies, quote, the heat they produce and release is captured, contained, and transformed into work by various mechanisms of extraction. This brutalism subjects the debased bodies, the energy, and the life of species to a slow combustion. End of the citation. And so, holding this idea of Simonon's reworking of ontology as really like a relation-centered conception of being, and this idea of energy with Mbembe, we see that if this energy that really like is what enables beingness itself or existence is captured and funneled through the apparatus of algorithmic capitalism, then what is disintegrating is not just beings, both humans and non-humans, but relations. And so the ontological reframing allows us to shift the focus when we design to other species, not just to other species, but to the operations that constitute all beings. So which to go fast are relations. But what does it mean to design for relations? I think this is a very open-ended question, but one clue that Simondon and Mbembe give us is that because relations are constitutives of beings are ever-changing or polyphasic, to use Simondon's expression. And so designing for relations is to account not just for current states, but also to design for encounters and spaces that have not yet been accounted for. So to account to the polyphasicness or multiplicity of all beings. And so I want to close with Mbembe's and this idea of the unaccounted for or the unaccountable, the invisible, among other things, these energetic exchanges, which empirically are extremely hard to measure, these relations that are difficult, if not impossible, to quantify. And so in his book, Mbembe reflects on the importance of certain technologies in sub-Saharan African countries where he works and lives, in particular the cell phone and smartphone. He writes, quote, it is perhaps at the philosophical, cultural, and imaginary levels that the impact of smartphones have been the most explosive. It is not sufficiently realized that pre-colonial African cultures were obsessed with all sorts of ontological and metaphysical questions. These questions concerned the limits of the earth, the boundaries of life, the body and the self, the theme of being in relation, of the human subject as an assemblage of multiple entities whose arrangement was a task that had to be constantly repeated. As their myth, their oral literatures, and their cosmogonies prove, among the big human questions which they asked themselves, there were those which concerned the world beyond the perceptible, the bodily, the visible, and the conscious. End of quote. And so these questions are pointing to a relation-centered approach to design because they account for the profusion of modes of existence, even those that we can see or hear or touch or measure directly. And many modes of existence are often imperceptible or unaccounted for, or have been absent from the main narratives that have irrigated design practices thus far. And so I'll just stop here for time's sake, and thank you so much for inviting me again and for your time and for the wonderful discussion. I'm very much looking forward to hearing all the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thank you, Gabrielle. I think it's really so rich, and I can imagine for our students there is so much, right, to unpack there with all the presentations, and it was very, very, very thought-provoking, all of your presentations. And I know there are in the public a lot of people that have a lot of things to say, and so before going back to Alder and perhaps wrapping up the conversation, also returning to her, I certainly want to also leave the floor to some comments or some ideas that might have emerged throughout the conversation. Our students and other colleagues that are there and very patiently, you know, all this time on Zoom and staying there just because the conversation is so inspiring and so rich. So I know for sure some people, I am not saying who, but some colleagues, and I can even imagine what they would have to say. But is there someone who wants to share some thoughts, or? Because otherwise, I think, Alder, also for in the economy of over time, perhaps you can start to address some of the provocation or some of the thoughts that have been shared in the very rich presentation that we had this afternoon, and then we'll see in the conversation if someone wants to jump in.
I certainly, and it's been such an interesting conversation. I have a lot to take away and sort of think through, and new readings that many people have brought up that I'm now curious to go chase down. Virginia, I think you said in an email exchange that this feels more like the beginning of a conversation than the end of a conversation. So I would echo that here. I seem to have a small invasion because they think that I am at the end of my time. Perhaps what I'll do is I'll pause the microphone while I get myself a little more clear airspace, and I'll come right back. Sorry.
No worries.
Virginia, we can't hear you.
I think things are clear now, but you may hear a little bit of complaining in the background. My two little feral creatures are running around here.
No worries.
The 3 points that I wanted to sort of mention, sort of thinking about where this brings us to, and maybe I won't get through all 3 of them, but I'll at least start with them. One of the things that I wanted to highlight that I'm finding most interesting in the conversation between anthropology and design, to put it that way, is the extent to which conversations about design bring us to a forward-looking perspective. They make ideas about futurity really concrete. I think because the actions in question, the sort of questions about what we do, also turn into questions about what we do with our material surroundings and how we would build those material surroundings in a way that would build a better future, or that might lead us towards rupture rather than repetition. I really appreciated that that phrasing. So that's one thought that I wanted to sort of mark, because it seems to me really unique and useful in this conversation. A second A second thought that I wanted to bring up was also I guess this question about, what does ontology get us to? Where does it get us if we're thinking about the more than human, and to what extent does that really sort of reinscribe a human-centric perspective even as it tries to move beyond it, or effectively limit the point of view? And I think there is, anytime you say human, without asking the question, which humans, and where the sort of points of difference in that conception are, I think you run into a danger of thinking about a sort of ideal type human that can center on a particular, a particular race, particular ethnicity, particular gender, particular set of abilities. So I think that's a really important critique, and one that I take to heart. It actually leads me toward wanting to comment on something that that has been, for me, a piece of post-Imperial Atlas work, together with an anthropologist named Jennifer Johnson, who is at Purdue. She's also an environmental anthropologist. And we've been thinking a lot about what it means for fieldwork and for ethnography particularly, that we're now digitally connected with the people that are, our interlocutors in remote field sites. We both have done field work in places that are quite far away, that are sort of classically hard to reach. Mine has been in the Bolivian Andes. Hers has been in Uganda on the shores of the body of water that we would call Lake Victoria, and there is an indigenous name for it that you'll have to forgive me, I'm not remembering at the moment. And we both have found that post-field work, one of the things that has really marked our experience is that we continue to be connected to the people that we know from the field on Facebook or through WhatsApp, or we see media on YouTube that's coming from these places where we do work. And I think Gabrielle used the term critical distance, the question about the critique of critical distance, and what Jennifer and I have been working on, very much from the perspective of American-born, white and cisgendered anthropologists, is what this new digital moment demands from us, particularly overlapping with, on one hand, the Anthropocene, so the concerns about environmental injustice, and then on the other hand, these rising pushes for addressing longstanding issues of historical racial injustice, so through Black Lives Matter or through new movements towards indigenous sovereignty. And we haven't published this yet. We're working on getting it out into review, but we're thinking, in opposition to the term critical distance, that part of what this moment requires is to think with critical proximity. So to think about these relationships not as if we could separate ourselves from them, but in fact as if our engagement in them demands a response, that it demands responsiveness. And the acknowledgement that we are all living together and needing to address these concerns simultaneously in a contemporary moment. There's no space in this moment to remove ourselves from this sort of simultaneous set of environmental harms and sort of budding or burbling social concerns that we're all thinking about. So I'm thinking a lot about critical proximity as sort of a framing for that set of questions. And then I guess the last thing that brings me to is that maybe one way I would point for, particularly for PhD students, I'll take all of you as a foil, is that I think, and some of the commenters alluded to this, one issue that seems to me is somewhat unaddressed in our conversation, and that's all right, we've addressed lots of things. I suppose the person who's put a comment in the chat has also kind of pointed to this, is the specificities of politics and policy. So the mechanisms that power works through, whether we're thinking about design or whether we're thinking about social policy. And I think this is a place where there's a path forward to kind of unpacking the uniformity that posthumanism or the ontological term can sometimes imply, in that if we're thinking with terms like indigenous, if we're thinking about sort of blanket indigenous terms, the critique that indigenous scholars and activists would make of that is, well, that's fine, but I'm not concerned about indigenous sovereignty broadly. I'm concerned about the Navajo territory and the fact that there is inadequate water access and food security on that territory, which comes from a different set of historical confirmations and current policies than, for example, if we're thinking about the Hopi territory right next door, or if we're thinking about the Amazonian indigenous territories. So I think once we kind of move to that question of thinking about, okay, what do we need to do in the world of politics and specific policies to design a way forward that is more just and more environmentally equitable, that can also help us to think about how do we move from a broad umbrella post-humanist ontology to much more specific and concrete ways of thinking about a different future. So I suppose I've spoken a lot, and I'll go ahead and mute my mic with another big thank you for these really interesting prompts.
Thank you, Alder. I think this is something that our students can really take away from the conversation, right? It seems like it's very theoretical, and there's indeed a lot of theoretical and challenging concepts, but it really can be translated in ways of designing for enabling new forms of politics and new form of living together amongst species. So before ending, I know that my colleagues Vanessa and Francesco have been working at mapping some of the concepts that emerged throughout the conversation. So I don't think we will have the time to get deep into that, but I certainly want to provide them the opportunity to share some of the thoughts that emerged from this amazing work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Virginia. Just a little bit, I will be sharing my screen. So I think you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so basically, as we already told you, this is the map the glossary map that you can find on the Instagram page. And as you can see, we added some concepts here and there. In particular, on the map that you will find on Instagram, you will find the two words that Alder Saxena didn't mention directly, so assemblage and disturbance, and you will find the definitions there. And obviously, we started mapping all the contributions here. You can see the contributions of our speakers today, and we started implementing, like putting all this information into the map. And I think we will be able to publish this map on Instagram, and also I think on the Philosophy Talk website.
Sure.
And I don't know if...
I think this will be very precious for the students, right? Because you will be working throughout this week, and you know, you had this conversation, and you have some time now also to you know, like to think about some of the thoughts probably will resonate with you in the next days. And this is a way also to keep a trace of the conversation and to help you also in order to create some links and imagine how can you practically also use, right, all these triggers, and also in order to really design more than human futures, right? So indeed, a Herculean piece of work. I totally agree with you, Alder. So again, thank you very, very much for this. And as we were mentioning, this feels like more a beginning of a conversation, right? It feels like we created a space, and it feels like there's a lot of you know, like a dialogue like this that still needs to happen, and perhaps also in other forms and in other ways. So I really want to thank all of you for what I personally take home from all of this conversation. I won't start talking, I swear, otherwise we will be again even more running out of time. But I perhaps want to leave the floor just to Annalinda to say the very final closing words.
Thank you all. I'm very happy that we had this wonderful conversation, and also for all the contributors that today shared. Also, through the video recording, we had something very valuable to really go into your reflections and your work and your researches, and to build on it. And I really hope that this conversation has been really useful for our students that are now approaching this very complex but fundamental concepts for any kind of research run in a design program, PhD design program. Maybe one closing thinking that I was noting down during the presentations is that this idea of that I found really important to underline, this idea that we from one side we say more than human, but we are still assuming that the human is there, that the human has a centrality in this, and even saying that, yes, but which humans, as Alder was saying before. So the point is that in any case, from human-centered to more than human, in any case, we are trying to find some boundaries where at the end boundaries are not possible, and we try in a way to build, to be more aware, to gain major awareness of the context that we should consider. But maybe the only conclusion that we can gain is that, yes, in this sense, we can only touch how we are infinite. We have an infinite role within this complexity, and maybe this can be a way to really understand how this critical distance can become a critical proximity, as Alder was saying, because we have no more this distance, but we are embedded in this complexity in which there are no hierarchies, let's say. So this is something that is not easy to embed in the way in which we run our research and in the way in which we read the world around us, but it is a very central point in this discussion. I think it's central in any kind of research. I don't know if Virginia wants to add something more. Otherwise, we can close the DESIS Philosophy Talk of today, and saying that everyone is really welcome to enjoy the other open session of the summer school that are planned for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So everything can be found online. And of course, at the end of all these 5 days, everything will be published online. So videos, recording, etc. So everything will be accessible for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. The conversation continues. And now, good evening, according to the time zone in which you are, to everybody. And thank you very much again. Take care. See you soon.
Ciao.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Going back to the idea of the Anthropocene, we want to remark the fact that it is not evenly distributed throughout the planet, yet it manifests in a patchy mode. This patchiness is linked also to a diverse distribution of disturbances, which is a concept that we would like to add to the discussion. Anna Tsing defines disturbances as a change in environmental conditions that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. From an anthropocentric point of view, disturbances are seen as negative, and indeed Anna Tsing calls them capitalist ruins. However, from a post-human perspective, disturbances are positive, because they open the opportunity to experience precarity and vulnerability, and to embrace relationality, which is a new perspective overtaking a self-contained perspective. Relationality generates new assemblage through indeterminate transformative encounters, where both humans and non-humans are transformed. And so assemblage is another concept that we want to introduce into the discussion. And by assemblage, we refer to the open-ended interactions between life forms living together in a community. Assemblage are diverse, indeterminate, and precarious.
Exploring modern human futures means to act politically within the assemblage, which requires a shift, an ontological turn from a self-contained perspective, the anthropocentric one, towards a collective idea of interdependency, contingency, and multi-species coexistence. This shift emerges from a gap in hegemonic and anthropocentric universal narratives and processes, allowing a new and counter-hegemonic potentials to emerge. The gap contains many inchoate futures, which lie in a state of indeterminacy and have to be articulated through political actions. Indeterminacy is a key aspect because, as Anna Tsing say, is not the end of history, but rather the node in which many beginnings lie in wait, many potentialities that have to be explored. To listen politically is to detect the traces of not yet articulated common agendas, helping some futures come into being by translating and making them visible. The gap is also characterized by the presence of elusive latent commons, which are hidden, fugitive moments of entanglement within the assemblage that might be mobilized in common cause. Anna Tsing provided a way to trace and perceive these latent commons through what she calls the art of noticing, that is, listening and observing the patches, looking for distinctive treasures.